Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Cyber Forum webinar series. Today is a little bit of an unusual date and time, but I imagine that some of you, this will be recorded and put on YouTube. So for those of you on YouTube, welcome to whenever you are and when you joined this. We believe that this is an additional service, and I'm going to speak extra fast so that if you put me on 1.5 speed, that you actually have to slow me down. We're very happy here today to have Jillian Grennan from Emory. She's a professor at the economics department there, and she will be talking about a paper titled Holding the Bag, Depositor Reactions to a Crypto Shadow Bank Collapse. So, she will talk about what happened in the wake of, or just around the collapse of Terra Luna and the like. I'm really excited about this. I've seen this paper presented once, and I know that Jillian is an excellent presenter. For the audience benefit too, Jillian has a very interesting background. Aside from being a trained economist, she also worked, as I understand it, for the World Bank, for instance, before, which is it's always nice when people can bring some experience beyond academia, because that kind of provides maybe a little bit of a bigger perspective on how the world works, and in particular for economic questions, it's relevant. And I think this is a very good example of this work. Just some housekeeping items. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them into the Q&A. The chat is disabled as it is, but please put questions that you might have at the Q&A. We will stop at various spots where either I ask questions or I may ask you to unmute yourself to ask questions about this particular paper or whatever it is that you have. And yeah, we go from there. So Jillian, how about I hand the floor over to you and you talk about your paper.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andreas. We're really excited to be here. I also want to let everybody know one of my co-authors, Josh White, who's at Vanderbilt and visiting the PCAOB right now, is also in the audience to help answer questions. And this is joint work with Ian Appel at Darden and Sean Wilkoff at University of Nevada. So thank you so much for having us. We're excited. Just so everybody gets to, there we go, that'll click my slides. Perfect. So the motivation for this paper is really a traditional financial motivation, right? We know that financial crises provide valuable information into how information flows through markets, how it shapes investor behavior. And, we've had a lot of great examples, right? We've had the Great Depression, we've had the global financial crisis, we've had really these amazing laboratories to understand extreme distress. But we know much less about the crypto markets. And so I took this quote from Michael Lewis. I think it's a fun one to say. Every financial crisis is different, but they all reveal the same underlying truth. Information is power, and those who have it survive, while those don't get wiped out. I think there is a belief, potentially, in crypto that we have more information, that, it was a response to the great financial crisis, and Bitcoin came out, and if you have more information, maybe you are not going to be susceptible to some of the problems. And so I really like this paper for looking at and thinking about, how do we compare with traditional banking? And I'm sure I'm going to give you some limitations and say, no, it's not a perfect comparison, but I think it's a fun one to think through where the differences are and why, to me, one of the surprising things is, right, we're in a world with so much information, but you might end up relying, surprisingly, on more coarse signals, like your stereotype of somebody or something like that in these types of situations. And so with that, this is the 2022 Celsius collapse. It took us a while because of a lot of the techniques and data analysis we had to do to get this paper where it is today. But really what happened at the time was there was billions in user assets essentially frozen overnight when a very trustworthy and transparent crypto bank collapsed. And one of the really cool things about this and why I really wanted to go after it was that they were a Delaware corporation, right? So many are crypto native organizations. I study DAOs a lot, but this was a Delaware court. So when they went to bankruptcy court, we got to see a lot of the pre-petition filings and a lot of the filings that we traditionally see in bankruptcy court, which allowed us to get more information than typically you would have in this type of situation. Okay, so what was our goal? Our goal was just to show how both formal and these sort of informal, more governance-y and cultural norms shape behavior before and after the collapse, and highlight what I really think of as this potentially overlooked identity fragility channel that could occur in both traditional and crypto markets. Why does this matter? I think big picture, 20% of US households do participate in crypto. I think this is growing. 93% of institutions recognize its utility, yet we have little regulation. And by showing how crypto crises spill over beyond sort of initial losses and how they overlap with traditional banking, I think we might help inform policy. I mean, these are the collapses. You would wonder, right? We have massive stablecoin adoption right now, as that's sort of the next wave. But you would wonder, there was a big crisis in 1929 and there was a whole generation that didn't go to the stock market. Is this going to be the same thing, that there was people who got burned early, maybe early adopters who now are not going to go there? And so this is something that we can sort of look at and think about. And this leads to our main questions. First, we're going to look at the withdrawal window and ask, how do monitoring incentives and cultural identity shape whether and when depositors withdraw during a collapse or of a shadow crypto bank? And then post-collapse, we're going to say, how do stranded losses influence subsequent portfolio choices? Right? Are they going towards risk-seeking and gambling for resurrection, or is this the more classical flight to quality? It's a risk-off trade. You know, does culture condition these responses? Does attention condition these responses? Okay. So what was Celsius? Well, Celsius operated as a crypto shadow bank and accepted deposits in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin from retail and institutional users. It paid interest and it lent out those assets, often in leveraged or illiquid forms. It was founded in 2017 and ultimately amassed more than 11 billion in digital assets and over 500,000 users worldwide. Its growth, though, really started to unravel when Terra Luna initially started to go through some of its liquidity, and that forced Celsius to ultimately suspend its withdrawals as well, about a month or so later. Okay, so what happened? Well, this is not perfect. I tried to pull it from their website. Their website was very heavily on a trust dynamic. Why trust Celsius? Celsius was founded in 2017 to provide fair and transparent services that have been abandoned by banks, fair interest, low rates for loans, and lightning quick transactions. They were a Delaware C Corp. They had their FinCEN. They had all of this compliance measures saying, look, we hire all these certified anti-money laundering specialists. And, they were featured in Bloomberg, Forbes, on Pomp, anywhere you'd want to see them, CoinDesk. They were out in the news and putting their name out there. What was it in reality? This was a nice Wall Street Journal article. So before crypto lender Celsius crashed, CEO Alex Mashinsky was known for big ideas and battles. Celsius was, he was a serial entrepreneur. And this was his fourth venture. He had successfully exited. He had this face. He had this voice. He was saying this is the future. He came from an immigrant background. He had that sort of great, I'm fighting for the underdog mentality, but I'm going to make it safer. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to do it right. And he really was, out there leading that. In reality, Celsius did start as advertised, but then to pay higher yields to its customer base, really it recognized that it was competing with a bunch of people. And, we also know at the time there were some things that were not exactly as they seemed in crypto. What they were doing is they started managing their assets more aggressively. And so they sort of similar to what happened at FTX, you put deposits and things that were highly leveraged, and then it sort of blew up on you. And that part of it led to a need to liquidate assets and ultimately led to some of their insolvency. So what do we do? I'm a data person. I really love data. I don't think everybody does, but I do. And so clever crypto forensics. I know, crypto accounts are typically pseudonymous. I have talked to many data vendors out there on what they can get me, what they can't get me, even if they promise they can get me that, it's not always there. And what we were trying to do is say, hey, because of the bankruptcy filings, we know who was claimants, we know their names. We also actually, because of the pre-petition, have a bunch of transactions that happened in the 90 days ahead of time. Well, actually, if you know 0.12345 ETH traded on a particular day, you can actually go to Etherscan and look up all the things that might have traded on that same block or that same day, right? And say, hey, can I match? And that's what we did. We went and we figured out what we could match, and then all of a sudden we knew the wallets that were linked to actual names. And when you're linked to actual names, you can get a whole bunch of demographics, you can get country culture, all of that type of information. And so this is really gives us sort of this granular, unprecedented access into understanding what happened for a particular person pre and post collapse. And I think this is very unique, right? In traditional finance, we actually do have, thanks to a lot of my old colleague Imanju Puri's work and others, we have a lot of information on from the FDIC and other places looking at pre-run dynamic or like run dynamics. We don't know as much about what happens afterwards, right? We usually don't see that. And so this is, to me, I think, a really cool contribution. We also add some theory. I'm not, there's a lot of stuff, vast literature on bank runs. What we try to do is show how in sort of one of the canonical settings where you have noisy signals and people are trying to coordinate on their actions, we say, well, what happens if, the noisy signal might be interpreted through a personal identity lens? And that personal identity, we're going to say, is shaped by your culture that could make you more individualistic or have more sort of deference to authority. All right, and that allows us to test out various mechanisms. We also look at traditional things like news and sentiment. And then we try to, use modern tools from causal inference. So we leverage sort of quasi-experimental variation, right? When they froze was very sudden. The day before, he said your assets are not frozen. It was a surprise to everybody that it was frozen. And you can very much see withdrawals, and suddenly no withdrawals. And so we're looking at those people who narrowly escaped to those who didn't escape and then therefore had stranded assets. And we're saying, what happens to them afterwards? Do their actions, do they basically leave? They stop engaging in crypto markets? They double down? What do they do? And then we lead to a policy discussion, right? This is one lender who is a shadow bank that failed. Right? They're not the biggest one. You could think of them as like a typical small, like regional bank. But we know that crypto is growing again. It's coming back. We have now much more in stable coins. While we have these like nice secure payment stable coins, we also have, as the US calls it, endogenously collateralized stable coins. We have things that might be higher risk. And what would happen in those situations? What would happen if there was a run? And so this allows us to sort of think more broadly. Mind you, I'm not going to generalize that much, but I do think that this channel, this fragility channel that we show, might be able to be suggestive of some regulatory tools out there. So our main findings, sort of unsurprisingly, traditional things matter. Sort of what we know from traditional finance actually also holds in crypto. That is monitoring. Institutions and large depositors withdrew earlier. They left fewer stranded assets. Information signals also seem to work. Withdrawals responded sharply to negative news and to insider withdrawals, consistent with sort of a fundamentals-based story and fundamentals-driven insolvency. What sort of, I think, adds to a flavor that we've seen maybe in earnings announcements where, places with weak enforcement and you have an earnings miss, you have seen sort of higher volatility on the ex-post trading. It's sort of exactly the same ideas that culture conditions your response to information. And so we see culture leading to either more aggressive withdrawals if you're from an individualistic country like the US, or if you're from a more deferential to authority country, delaying your withdrawals. We looked at portfolio composition afterwards. So the depositors, what did they do? Well, those surprisingly with larger stranded assets, maybe not, I wasn't sure what we'd see here. They ended up allocating more towards high risk tokens, but that actually raised portfolio returns, but not on a adjusted basis, right? So they have adjusted higher returns, but if you look at their Q or anything like that, it would suggest they were taking on unprecedented risk. And so we look at that, and then the big picture, we sort of saying that both formal and informal matter, but we think of culture as a double-edged sword that both stabilizes, right, the depositor base in normal times, and then it amplifies this fragility in crisis times. There's a large related literature, and I meant to go back and add more here, but I will admit I haven't done it full justice. I think of a lot on the crypto and DeFi demographics. Scott Baker's got some great work here. So did the people who got eToro. We also have depositor behavior and bank runs. There's vast literature there. Sort of highlighted that the culture and trust literature, just because I know in crypto, trust and culture are not necessarily things that are often looked at. There is a big literature that suggests these are first order determinants of financial decision making. little bit more of the digital downturn. So Antoinette's nice paper on Terra Luna, as well as like Will Kong and Daniel Rabetti and others work on really bringing crypto forensic or accounting methods to this space. And then I will say that there's another study that's also looking at the Celsius collapse. I think of our main difference is that we really did go out and get this wallet data and to be able to look at it ex post, and really they're, I think, more thinking about it in early stages, and we're looking at it more in what happens afterwards. Okay, so let's go into the background, or does anybody have any
Okay, so
questions?
let me interrupt you there for a few seconds. Sorry, Jillian, Jill. So can I ask? I mean, you may be actually talking about this at some point, but I mean, in many ways, Celsius is a very particular case, right? Because it is really an offline business in many ways, right? So as you described this, right? So people put their money into Celsius, then they do stuff there that use. It's not really like a DeFi application. It is really a centralized application where they took decisions. So that's one question I have that relates to what I want to ask next. And then it's also the question of, is there anything about the particular clientele that you see where we can say either that this is something that generalizes or that it doesn't generalize? And I'm asking that question because you're referring to the impeding proliferation of stablecoins and usage of crypto and blockchain. And so I'm wondering in a way, it's like things have actually definitely changed since 2022, right? So a lot more decentralized applications are available where there are, you would, for instance, be able to at least have some form of assessment of the riskiness of certain business loans, which you didn't have in Celsius. So to what extent and what part of the market do you think that your study can, without actually telling us exactly what you did, generalize?
Yeah, so I think if you're thinking about applications right now, it is definitely more the real world assets and the people who are trying to bridge between TradFi and DeFi. And so maybe think of places like Goldfinch, which also went under, but then now we have Athena and State and others that are really trying to do the same thing, centralized backhouse, but make sure that this token is available for trading. We've seen an explosive growth in private credit on chain. And so I think of it a little bit that way. And then the user base, I do have some statistics on this later. We are very on target with the other studies that have looked at this. So Michael Weber has a nice piece where he had, I don't know if it was Nielsen's or somebody, but he worked with Scott Baker also has his stuff that I think's been with Wealthfront, and then eToro. So we benchmarked to all of those. We are roughly similar in that this is, mostly a white and Asian male population who was also using this product. So in that sense, it's not that different than traditional fintech adoption, even in spite of this being like trying to target it and market itself as trustworthy, right? You might think they might have had greater female use, and I was sort of in line with what we'd seen before. So on that dimension, I don't know. One of the things though that I do think that you said that I really liked was thinking about where the policy wise of generalizing. And I think this idea that even if you have a targeted niche group, you can create a fragility channel through it, right? Because sometimes everybody trusts everybody, but then you have this moment where then everybody's beliefs change. And that synchronized moment is what then leads to these shocks sort of percolating through the system and perhaps percolating at a much faster pace than we would think. And so, this is where, one of the nice things I even look at later is imagine this, there wasn't as much smart contract action, right? What you were saying then. And we can separate our trades in the wallet to those that were smart contract initiated versus trades that were actually the person was proactively transacting. And, but yet there was all these automatic smart contract maneuvers. And I've thought about this for a while from a regulatory perspective. We don't really have the same kill switch that we have in the circuit breaking way that we have in equity markets. And I do think that these are additional lessons to think about as we move forward and try and find, the right set of tools for a world that is, on-chain native and moves a lot faster, but maybe you can put in a composable piece that is circuit breaking-esque.
So
Uh,
let me just say two more things. So
yeah,
first,
yeah, that's
I
fine.
just have to get it out there because it's actually it's somewhat fitting. I know most of you in the audience are probably American, but I'm from Canada, and we had our budget for the next year was revealed yesterday. It works a little different, so we don't really have a government shutdown over this. So sorry, people. But here's one thing that came in there, which was a certain portion which was about stablecoins. And so the way things work in the Canadian budget is that the government actually scores it based on which part of the population a particular measure benefits. And so the stablecoin regulation to create more clarity and to create more safety for users was particularly to the benefit of men, which my wife found extremely entertaining. But I thought I'm just going to throw this out there because I think this is something that you will be talking about later of in terms of demographics that were mostly affected by in particular by the Celsius bankruptcy. But maybe also, and because this relates to a question in the Q&A, maybe you can just reiterate one more time why you have to pivot from going from informational asymmetry to cultural differences. So how do you see the relationship there? So just so that in the following discussions, people have a very clear vision of what your vision for the paper is.
Yeah. So what do we know about when culture seems to matter, right? It matters when enforcement is weak. It tends to matter when there's coordination, there is information asymmetry. And so a lot of the literature, you might be like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's not first order, but that's like tends to be a person who's US centric, who is in a, high contract, high law enforcement region. And then there's all this evidence, whether it is from bank loan officers or it is in firms where you can't contract on every relationship with your coworkers, right? And so that's where culture sense matter. I think of the crypto space is where, maybe we've gotten better, right, with smart contracts or maybe it's all auditable code, maybe not, right? That there's trust in different places. Trust could be in technology, which is a different form of trust. And so thinking through some of those dynamics, but I do have a slide on it definitely later that I will make sure to highlight. Hopefully
Yeah,
today.
maybe we'll let you
Today.
carry on with your
All right, all right.
presentation.
Let me go in and see. Okay. So just to go back to give everybody some debrief on what is Celsius, they had different types of accounts. They essentially had earn accounts, custody accounts, and withheld accounts. We talk about custody a lot from a regulatory perspective. Honestly, most people didn't put it in the custody account. Why? Because the custody account didn't earn you interest rates. So the vast majority of people put their stuff in an earn account, which was what paid actual interest rates. They also had a special withheld account because some jurisdictions wanted it to be able to maintain custody even if they didn't put it in a custody account. Okay, so in bankruptcy, it's really those earn account, everything that was in the earn that ended up becoming part of the Celsius estate. And so, you can think about this with Coinbase today. People still complain about it, right? If Coinbase were to go bankrupt, the same thing. They're not FDIC insured. You would be part of the Coinbase estate. Okay. So earn accounts are the focus of our analysis because they were the ones that really exposed them to credit liquidity. And then to generate the high yields offered, and right, remind you what time this was. This was the time when ICOs were all the rage. They relied on their CEL token and what they called their flywheel strategy. So the CEL token, it was a native utility token that they launched in 2018. They were founded in 2017. So they started the business and then they decided to do this to sort of raise additional capital, which is not unsurprising and sort of the way things worked. They used then the CEL to pay user rewards and to market the token as a measure of the company's success. And so the idea was you could choose to get your rewards in USDC, or you could choose to get your rewards in CEL. If you got them in CEL because you were like sort of embracing the company and its model, you got slightly higher returns. In practice, CEL's price then became heavily sort of associated with the growth or as a perception of the financial strength of the company. But when things started to go downhill, that's when they started to internally manipulate the price. So it wasn't that they've been manipulating it all along. It was really a lot later on towards 2021, 2022, when they started to buy back a lot of their CEL and then also allowed some insiders to make very sizable sales. Okay, and then basically the CEL token strategy is this idea, and it is not a Ponzi scheme, but it's this idea that you market to new users, they're bringing in deposits, which seems Ponzi-like, but part of it was that the way that the profits were put in through the sell token. The sell token could also appreciate in value because it was representative of the whole company. And so if you think of like a loyalty or some type of intangible going in there, that's why you have additional sort of incremental cash flow streams attributable to the sell token. Okay. So the promises versus the reality. I mean, and this is, we actually went back, thank you Wayback Machine. We were able to go back and they daily posted their rates of interest. There was no rhyme or reason to their interest rates that they charged other than they were really trying to beat the core competition. There didn't seem to be a correlation between their interest rates and the actual investment yields that a person could get at the time, which took us a while to figure out. And for most of Celsius's existence, the rewards paid to customers actually substantially exceeded the revenues they could make. They wanted to attract people, and so they were not, that was one of their pitfalls, is that they made that mistake of paying people more than they should have. Okay, where did this probably come from? Well, this came from this guy, Alex Mashinsky, their CEO. He was a successful serial tech entrepreneur known for media promotions. When asked about what would happen in the event of bankruptcy, Alex told customers coins are returned to their owners, even in the case of bankruptcy. That is totally not true, right? At the same time, there were reports and evidence of his insider trades, but this is him on NASDAQ. This is him in a bunch of different, on the podcast. He really was just all over the news at the time. And then I just wanted to show people this one. You can find this on Twitter. This was June 11th, the day before they declared the withdrawal freeze. He tells users on social media that Celsius has plenty of liquidity. We have plenty of liquidity, and anyone who needs their coins can get them the same day. The storm will pass soon. So very remarkable. And just so people can really understand if people thought of it as a bank or if they thought of it as more casino-like gambling, all the letters in bankruptcy court really made it seem that it was bank-like, right? He kept saying phrases like unbank yourself and banks are not your friends to imply that leaving funds with Celsius is just like depositing funds on savings accounts with traditional banks. Or this one, we trusted the company was run in safe and productive manner because their leader always expressed that. And another one, I trusted Celsius with my funds and continue to do so despite market volatility and rumors about their solvency. CEO Alex Mashinsky reassured everyone on various media platforms that Celsius is financially strong and had enough collateral to weather the downturn in the market. Okay, so what ended up happening? This was the founding, we heard the launch, we sort of saw this. So this is when, May 7th to 12th was when the collapse of Terra Luna triggered basically liquidity stress across crypto markets. And then about a month later on June 12th is when they froze their withdrawals. And then June 13th, they filed for July, so a month later they filed for bankruptcy and the SEC subsequently filed fraud charges. It was not a Ponzi scheme. It did have a viable business model, but it had deteriorating fundamentals. And so that it made the continuation value fall below its liabilities. So I'm going to take a break and go into the data, but does anybody have a question on the business model or we're good? We're good? Okay.
I think we're good. Business model was clear.
All right, so let's go into the data. So the thing about this is that we combine a bunch. So I think of bankruptcy filings is in the center. And then we've got the crypto market data, we've got news data, we've got blockchain and demographic data, we've got what we matched to the forensics and the insider trading data. And this is what's going to allow us to really test these formal and informal factors driving withdrawals and the post-collapse response. We really did need to integrate just many data sets. And so we start with the bankruptcy filings. There's two complementary ones. You can think of them as the transaction level filing, which is the flows that looked at the 90 days prior to the withdrawal halt. And so it records deposit, withdrawals, transfers, interest payments, everything. And it allows us to look at this pre-collapse behavior. We also went further back in time until January, just to look at it as well. We also then looked at the snapshot. So, right, this is your user balances as of the bankruptcy date. And this would tell us the names, right, and their holdings in the earned custody and withhold accounts. And then through this mix of transactions and that, you can back out exactly how much they were left holding in their accounts. or had at the beginning. So you could think of a ratio of stranded assets. And we really want to focus on what's stranded because it was in an earn account rather than other accounts. So then when we're going to link these accounts, we're going to start by just linking to traditional information signals, right? You might think news sentiment drives it. Well, we looked at articles from Celsius about Celsius pulled from Masari, which includes general and crypto-specific outlets. So think of CoinDesk, Decrypt, Blockworks. And sentiment was calculated using a finance-adjusted positive and negative word list, sort of very traditional way to do sentiment. The crypto prices and trading volume, we just pulled it from CoinGecko. And then the insider and institutional trades. So you can identify trades from bankruptcy filings, and we decided to go with those ones because we thought they were the most complete. We also publicly pooled some data with wallet tagging services. So think of Nansen, which we use to verify the institution's identity. And I think we are like 99% matched on institutions. So I think that data was readily available if you wanted it. So then linking user activity to demographic and cultural data. So we have to add in this sort of informal mechanism, right? And so the non-redacted bankruptcy filings provide depositor names, which we use to then infer gender. You can do a gender bind. We use different algorithms, and then we take the composite score of the different algorithms. These are leading algorithms across the space that LLMs and everybody else are using. The only difference I would say that's sort of a little bit here, how do you get the cultural heritage? It's mapped from the country. So what Hofstede did, which I'll talk about, is he's done 6 different times, and he's an anthropologist, and he has went into countries and he classifies their culture. And so we took the most recent timestamp, which I think was 2022 or almost roughly the same year. And we took those mappings and said, this is your score based on where you are from. Okay. And we focused on, he has 6 measures that are thought to be orthogonal. We focused on individualism, power, and to a lesser extent, uncertainty avoidance, because those ones seem the most driven by theory. So
Can
details
I
on the,
just ask you a quick question, Jillian, on
yeah.
this? So, because this particular measure that you have applies to the average person in an average country, right? So you take people, the average American, the average German, the average French person. Is that the way to understand it? The reason why I'm asking is you kind of have to worry. You have to worry a little bit whether or not the average person and the person who is in crypto, which is possibly, arguably a more risky asset class, could be very different. So the question is whether or not it really translates from the across the risk preferences that you have.
Right. So I think that there's 2 things to think about this. One is that in general, the cultural literature has shown that it's pretty well established that where you grow up seems to influence you not just, this year, but 10, 20, 30 years later. So I do think of them as like generally traits that are as similar as your family and sort of giving you these long standing. And remind yourself, what is culture? Culture is what you do when there is no formal contract. It's what guides your expectations in those moments that you don't have anything explicitly that's a rule telling you to do it. And so this is where it comes back to a lot of innate development. And I think of that as being very based on who you are. That being said, that we might have measurement error. Totally agree that we might have measurement error. Typically, we think of, depends on the form of the measurement error, and you can sign it in regressions, as it would work against us finding results. And I can think about that and sort of let you think about it too when I show the regression results. But it's a fair point. Well taken.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so then thinking about his measures, I would say though we're not like recreating the scale on measures, right? He does have just on this one book that was the original book about it, 123,000 citations on it. And so the way you think about them is power distance is really everybody's equal to more hierarchical deference to authority. Individualism, that's sort of I think of as a person who has, read many of these papers too. I work in the culture space. You think about rice farmers, and it was a traditional thing that they shared water. And so we've seen that like has led to, in countries that had more rice farming, just like a much more we collectivist attitude versus places that have, in the US, were considered this rugged individualism. And then the last one is more this uncertainty avoidance, which is, are you open to ambiguity? ambiguity, or would you really like us to have rules and codes? Okay, I sort of went into this already, but what we were really doing was, using basically reverse engineering the on-chain identities of bankruptcy claimants. And that way we got that was we pulled two different data sets from Morales. Once we had the hash that represented the wallet, you can pull both wallet holdings because we wanted to see things that they may have held for really long times. Were they like a Bitcoin whale from like the early days? We also wanted to see their transactions. Okay, so we pulled each set of data. And then we think of this as adding to a lot of really nice work that I've been seeing coming out lately in this crypto forensic space. We also examine the transactions and trades based on risk. So we calculate wallet returns, so a three-factor crypto model, the Lewinol paper in the JF that gets lots of citations, as well as allocations to stablecoin, sort of medium and high-risk digital assets. CoinGecko provides a risk assessment. We also had RAs just like read through business descriptions. I will tell you, it doesn't matter, especially when we look at the leading coins, right? We have also a lot of just sort of very, they held 500 plus coins. It's not that they were like only concentrated in 20. Okay. I will admit, right? So who we were able to match to because they traded 0.1234 ETH is not exactly who maybe is a selected sample as well, right? So we were able to find them. The two coins that we really focused on trading were ETH trades and USDC trades. And we were able to match about 32,000 of these transactions, which led to 31,000 unique wallets. We had almost 500,000 wallets, so it's really about 10% of the sample. And we matched all their selected sample. They're more likely to be held by Asian and Caucasian males. They have larger initial balances. So the ones that we could find that were trading, they had 75,000 in their earn account versus 18,000 on average. They held more unique tokens. They often held like 6 tokens versus 3 for the typical person. And they were way less likely actually to have stranded assets. Only about a fifth of them, or 20%, had stranded assets versus 83% for the full sample in the claimant's filing. So what do they look like? This is your standard user. This is HODL Celsius Network on Bank Yourself. These are sort of some of their namesakes. So it is a diverse base, but the modal user is an Anglo-Saxon male, a retail user, right? 75% are male, a little more than 25% are white. They're from a high individualism culture, which is considered the US, high uncertainty avoidance, Germans. We did have, I think, 15% German, or low power distance. So things like Israel. And then there was skewed initial holdings, right? The mean was actually only about 19,000, the median 354, and the 99th percentile over 250,000. And this is in US dollars. So we will be careful to look at and cut on high value wallets as well, just to think that they might be totally different than what is the median or mean user here. And then compared to academic surveys, they do pretty much match up on a variety of ones, but it would suggest that, it is a niche segment of the population. Just to see, because I know about time, but they're using Bitcoin, Ethereum, USDC, Cell, Matic. These were the top transactions, but also even Aave. So it's the early DeFi days too, so not as popular as some other ones, but Solana's in the middle. They also had 40 other plus tokens that they transacted in. If I look at their wallets and what they held, they also had a lot more in their wallets. But this was simply from the 90-day pre-period transactions of what they were doing. And it was roughly, Bitcoin was obviously the most popular. Maybe not obvious. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move into the theory section. So was this a sunspot run or a fundamental run, right? There's two types of runs. There's this diamond jig, multiple equilibrium, panic without a change in fundamentals. And then there's the Gary Gorton Moore style fundamental run, which is triggered by information about a deteriorating balance sheet quality. So sunspot, fundamentals. I think of us as basically using traditional information to test for a fundamental run. So we are implicitly assuming it is, and it seems like it was based on everything you could read from the commissioner's report. So there was an observable deterioration before the freeze. Thus, we would expect to see internal Celsius data, so such as insider withdrawals, before weeks before the user withdrawals halted. We'd expect to see more gradual, predictable dynamics, right? So it's not an instantaneous panic, but as information got out there, it went into the system. And then also think of it as information signals, right? We would examine if larger, more sophisticated users like institutions exit earlier. That would be consistent with monitoring and sort of this informed runs and the work that's out there. So Itai Goldstein's work, Charlie Calamaris's work, and others. So this, now the question about culture. So I think of culture as a first order for financial decisions. Why? When formal enforcement is weak, right? There is no regulation, and especially at this time in crypto, there was no deposit insurance on this stuff. Then beliefs are going to drive coordination and makes culture first order. And so we know this from prior literature, right? Trust substitutes for institutions. There's a nice paper in the JFE that shows that stronger societal trust amplifies investor reactions to company sort of misses in earnings, and the effect is strongest where investor protection is the weakest. So, right, it's this trade-off. There's a balance between informal and formal institutions, and you have to trade them off. Then this is a nice one too, just thinking about the way we're thinking about information with Mark Lipson and others in the RFS that documents how info flows through these trust-based networks, right? There was pre-release tipping by analysts to favored clients, and you could see how market prices basically followed these information patterns that through trusted networks. And same thing that trust matters under stress. So you have Manju's nice paper in the AAR that shows trust and relational capital. And so they were looking at, lending relationships in India, but that they dramatically reduce withdrawal probabilities in a traditional bank run. So our setting, I think, combines exactly that. We had weak enforcement. They were not, this was before even people with stablecoins are once a month you must put up your reserves. This was well before the what collateral do you have and what collateral should you post and tell people about. This was also, which could lead to these belief-driven coordinations. So I think allowing for culture to modify how users might interpret a signal is sort of definitely a first order, not a residual. Okay, next, sort of incorporating formal and informal mechanisms into the model, right? So the formal will be thinking more about the balance sheet strength. The informal, such as cultural norms, will shape how depositors interpret information and act under uncertainty. We're going to have two dimensions, this individualism, so willingness to go against the grain, I think of it, and power distance, which is deference to authority. They're going to change withdrawal behavior, even with the same fundamentals, right? That's the key to understanding it. So you have depositors face uncertainty about the platform's solvency. They rely on what they see themselves and what they hear from the platform. Each depositor makes two choices, whether to withdraw at all and how much to withdraw if they do. We're going to make withdrawing costly, and we think of it as sort of fixed frictions to deter simple or impulsive withdrawals. You can think of it like gas fees or lost interest. And then variable frictions that increase with withdrawal sizes. So maybe if everybody wants to withdraw at once, gas fees dramatically go up. So our model then extends the classic coordination failure setup by allowing behavioral differences from culture to influence withdrawal choices. So culture shifts how the depositors are interpreting that same information. So individualism would say, hey, I have lower pressure to conform. I see that the sentiment in the news is negative, but I'm willing to make my own decision. Or I can see that it's positive today because Alex was out talking, but I know better. I'm going to do it. And so that would tend to say you're willing to move to earlier, more with aggressive withdrawals. Whereas power distance, it's almost you have this pain, you have this emotional penalty, right? That increases your deference to authority if you go against the group. And so you're going to have delayed or smaller withdrawals. The key idea is the comparative statistics is that when you have high idea individualism, you're going to have higher withdrawals, fewer stranded assets. Opposite, higher power distance, lower withdrawals, more stranded assets. Okay. And I think this picture helps.
So can I interject for 1 second? So I'm trying to think about the stories, and I'm not saying that there's reason to believe what you're saying makes sense. I'm just wondering also if there would be another way to see the world as it stands at the time when Celsius collapsed, right? Which is that you have, as you say yourself, right? So you have a world in which there are all these new entities, firms. I mean, Celsius was actually a corporation that emerged in a world where there is a little bit like a Wild West feeling, right? So where, no rules really apply. And so as you say, right, so this is a world in which, you know, conceivably you could argue that insider information plays a role and that illegal behavior could play a role, right? And so I'm wondering if the cultural differences you describe is also a question of the ability for enforcement of rules. So you can imagine a world in which people from some cultural background believe that the rules cannot be enforced, whereas from other backgrounds they believe it can be enforced. And so that the cultural difference there is not so much in your behavior, but in terms of what you believe that higher authorities can actually do. And I'm asking this question because Andre Posa asked a question about whether the World Trust Survey is a good measure for that, which kind of has the same vibe for it, right? So in the Trust Survey, I'm not that familiar, but I imagine how much you trust your institutions will play a role. Now, this is not to say what you're saying is not right, but have you considered something that is competing hypothesis?
So I don't think it is necessarily a competing hypothesis. So I think of it as trust. I think you can, and it is on my to-do list. I will admit, in the World Value Survey, I do have it at a later point to pull the trust measures. I think one of the things here that I was really trying to go with, and I think it's also totally a fair point, although I don't know how you'd put it in the model, right? Because user fixed effects typically, which we put in with would go over these country fixed effects that you sort of want. So in some sense, it's nice that we have users rather than, sort of the complaint on any cross-country analysis is that it's all a country situation. But I do think it's a good question and it's worth thinking more. I think of trust as one very specific dimension of culture. And for me, and I think this is like why I guess trusts run such a fine line with integrity. And what I think is actually here, it's not like you're trading on integrity. And it is not like there's any degen who thinks of themselves as really like high integrity, or maybe they do. Whereas I think that this idea, especially that came out in the bankruptcy notes, and actually why we ended up reading through or we had ChatGPT help us read through hundreds of bankruptcy notes to pull those quotes, was that there were people who really wanted to explore it, but wanted to explore crypto in a safe way. And so they were like, let me find this person who is like a natural leader. And you go to this natural leader. Whereas there's also a whole sect of people that I think sort of, or at least for me, would more fit the traditional crypto profile of being highly individualistic. And these are the countries that we tend to see represented, right? The US is 56% of our sample. It's a highly represented country. So I don't know. That's sort of the way I think about it. But a fair point on definitely want to look at trust and world value surveys as well. Okay.
Okay.
Last little thing, just so people can see it visually and remember what we were doing. If we think of this as your withdrawal share, 100% withdrawal, and this is sort of trading off the benefits of withdrawing versus the cost, which is actually how you get to our comparative static in the model if I would have shown all of that. What is really happening with individualism is it's shifting up the marginal benefit. It's saying, oh, it's better for me to go against the grain and withdraw now, and so I'm going to withdraw more. And whereas a person in power distance, it's actually on the cost side, right? It's saying that, oh, it's costly for me. I feel some pain from going against the grain. And so therefore it's going to shift it down. But when it shifts it down, what ends up happening is that, if I'm a high power distance, it would shift it up. What ends up happening is then I withdraw a lower share. Okay. All right. So that's all I have to get up to the pre. Let's think about also what happens after depositors suffer losses. I think there's a few canonical yet competing theories. So one is gambling for resurrection. When investors incur losses, they may take excess risk to break even. So this is early stuff by Dick Thaler, but also Dick Barbaras, Alex Moss, and Rolly Hoymer all have like very nice work recently on it, which would predict a tilt towards high-risk lottery-like tokens and a few large positions. There's nuance in this literature about realized versus unrealized losses. We do have realized losses here. There's also nuance about your reference point, and I will admit we're looking into more of the nuance on reference points. There's also this literature on flight to quality, right? Large literature after, especially the great financial crisis, and thinking about that. That would predict tilting to stable market dominant tokens and maybe expect less trading or even exiting and more diversification. Or if you think of even going back to the depression babies and Malmendier and Nagel, this might say, hey, I'm leaving the market altogether. Then there's this, I think of it as separate from both of these because it leads to slightly different predictions. The Brad Barber and Terry O'Dean on the attention chasing, saying, look, attention is scarce after shocks, so you're going to buy salient but speculative assets rather than screening opportunities. And so what this is saying is that you're going to tilt more towards high momentum, high visibility tokens, and then your activity is going to be clustered more in these short bursts when all of a sudden you pay attention. And so this can separate from these people who seem to be more actually just going towards this risk of gambling for resurrection. And then the way we're connecting it to measures, so we're thinking about, exit versus escalation. Are you transferring in and out new funds? We can see that in your wallet. We can see high versus low risk tokens, bucket it by dominant share tokens as well. Trading intensity, again, transaction counts, but things like sending versus and receiving versus bot trades and gas fees you paid. You can also see your concentration. So HHI measures the size of the largest position and adjusted returns. So the whole point, though, is that even in the post-collapse period, we believe after losses, reactions are likely to not be uniform and that culture can amplify or mitigate the response. Just as sort of news or any price information might as well. Okay, so with that, I'm ready to get into the results. I think it's exciting. Any questions? No, I think we're good. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so stranded assets. Took us a while to think about how do you pull half a Bitcoin out and what should be your stranded asset ratio. We did it all based on the final day and your realized loss. And then it's anybody with greater than 25%, although we have changed this number and none of the results are sensitive to picking 25% versus 100% loss or something like that. Okay, so the empirical design, right? This is more descriptive work, so it's just going to be an OLS and a logit regression. And we're going to have a bunch of controls based on demographics and account use. Were you always using the earn exclusively, or did you also use some of the custody accounts and stuff like that, which might signal that you're a more sophisticated user. Okay, so what we see, greater monitoring incentives reduce stranded assets. Perfect, traditional information holds. Institutions have lower both intensive, the stranded asset ratio, and extensive Martian stranded asset indicator. They have larger initial balances, so this is the initial holdings in your earn account. Also will withdraw more. So this is suggesting both financial sophistication and exposure are correlated with withdrawals, which is what we'd know from traditional banking. This sort of helps you visualize what's going on. So this was Terra Luna, right? And this is the users are the blue. So they definitely spiked up to withdrawal, probably to cover liquidity in Terra Luna or other things. And they spiked up right at the end. Interesting, the gold and the red, which is other insiders and the CEO, different. The other insiders and CEO clearly must have known around here, where we see no changes in sort of most of the regular users, that they were clearly going to be insolvent. Okay, and so then we can look at that more in this setting. Okay, and so we see depositors are sensitive to traditional information signals. What this is showing us is that news sentiment, when it's more positive, you're less likely to withdraw. When sell returns are higher, and remind you the way they had their flywheel strategy, that sell returns are supposed to be an indicator of strength in the company, you're less likely to withdraw. Sell volume is higher. This one, the way I think about it is that most of the sell volume was driven by Celsius itself. So this is suggesting that they had enough to buy back and they were driving it. You also see fewer withdrawals. And this is the insider withdrawal indicator. So you can see the insiders withdrawing and you actually do see more withdrawals. So some people were responsive, especially when we're doing things. I also want to recognize that, right, Terra Luna happened. How can one account for Terra Luna? Okay, one method is to just drop any Terra Luna observations, which is this column, which is not that different from this column. Another method is to put in Terra Luna controls, right? I can see if you held Luna or any of those tokens in your account. And so if you do, I can call you a Terra Luna person and therefore put in a control for that. All right, doesn't really matter either way. Some other results it can matter, but generally it's pretty good. So this suggests that, again, depositors are both sensitive to regular things we know and information signals. So this gets us into the now saying, okay, we know traditional stuff work. What about some of these informal things? And so we're going to put in individualism, right? And we're just putting it in by itself just to say, does it even have any explanatory power by itself? And individualism, you're less likely to have stranded assets. Power distance, so you're deferential to authority, you're more likely to have stranded assets. We can put them in together and it holds when they go together. And then we can put it in with an indicator and a bunch of controls, right? Which is both of these settings. And it holds. These controls include demographic controls, so it's not just like it's that you're male or female or something like that. It also includes all the earn account characteristics and that type of stuff. So, and institutional, so how sophisticated you are as well. So this suggests, again, that we're something else there we're relying on when it's in this uncertain crypto environment. Okay, and so then next we're going to move into if these culture plays a difference in our reaction, right? Remember, individualism might amplify our reaction, whereas power distance might mediate our reaction. And so what we do, and I can do it with all of them, but I'm just showing these ones for example, is sell news sentiment, right? We know when the news sentiment is more positive, you're less likely to withdraw. But we see that if you are from an individualistic culture, that amplifies it. You're even more likely to withdraw. Same thing, if insiders withdraw, it's the opposite direction. You're more likely to withdraw, and then you're even more likely to withdraw. What I think is nice is this contrast here with power distance, right? This is negative. This is now positive. And so that's saying that the exact same information that was the sentiment is interpreted differently when you're in a power distance setting. And same thing with insider withdrawals, it's interpreted differently. And so the fact that in this sort of quadrant, all of the signs go in the same way really helps me believe that it is something about these, long-standing inherited cultural traits that amplify your reaction. And later I'm going to talk about sort of similarities, right, that we can think of in the traditional bank run setting, where we see this amplification through, again, cultural traits. Okay, you ready for me to do post-collapse results?
Hold on. Sorry, too slow to click. Yes, I think we're there. So just go on.
Okay.
So we
Cool.
can.
Yeah. All right. So the post-collapse stuff, what we're going to do is really a difference in differences design. Right. So we know that when it was frozen, we're going to put in a Terra Luna control, right? Because we think Terra Luna was, again, a big thing. Here, the Terra Luna control is a person-specific Terra Luna control. And so that is why, in some senses, you're not going to get it by itself, because it would be collinear with the user fixed effects. Standard errors are clustered at the wallet level. And what we're really focusing on is the effect of having stranded assets on the post-collapse behavior. Okay, this is our average treatment effect for high-risk transactions, sort of showing you visually what we're going to look at later, which we don't see any pre-trends, but we are divergence in pre-trends, but we do sort of see afterwards that there's this spike up in sort of going towards riskier transactions. And the formal tests fail to reject the pre-treatment coefficients are jointly zero. Okay, so let's look at the wallet transactions. This is where we start. We see fewer transactions, and it's mostly this proactive. So they get rid of the bot transactions. It's really driven by fewer proactive transactions. And then when we look at the token risk, we're seeing less activity in low risk tokens. Here it's insignificant for high risk tokens, but I will break this down a little bit more later. So right now the initial evidence is suggesting that, we are changing our behavior. We are doing less trading. So this is sort of maybe a flight to quality or sort of a little bit of a shock, right? That would initially happen. Then we turn to look at this risk return profile. And this is where it really, because we're looking at shares now in the portfolio, you definitely moving, the largest share you're moving is out of these market cap dominant. You're getting out of Bitcoin, you're getting out of Ethereum, and instead, you're not even getting in USDC or even the sort of more medium risks, say, right? We saw that there was like a lot of Aave, that they're going in these very high risk tokens. Okay. Interestingly, these high risk tokens are associated with higher weekly returns. And these are adjusted weekly returns. So using the three-factor model, this would suggest that you're gambling for resurrection. And actually to differentiate, I didn't put up the new table, but to differentiate between what I was saying, this attention-based, so the Terry O'Dean theory, is the momentum. And we can put up the momentum one, and we are not seeing them chasing momentum. So I don't think it's a story of that. I think of it as a story of let's gamble for resurrection. And so I'm really hoping that we can also get these reference point stuff to see who had bigger losses and see if we can see it there. But
So,
this is
so,
still
so
work
you're
that we
saying,
can
can I
talk.
interrupt you for 1 second, just so I understand this? So these are people who have been dinged badly, who actually lost assets, and then they go out and they double down to, as you say, to basically recover the losses in the past. Is that what you're saying? Or are these people who dodged a bullet and say, "It's my lucky day, better play the lottery too today"? Is that
Yes, so this is definitely the we um this is so the coefficient, right? So treatment is people who had stranded assets. So these would be saying that the people who, have losses, and these are realized losses, they're then getting out of market cap dominant and going into high risk tokens. And that is also associated with greater returns in their portfolio. So it is your
interesting?
gambling for resurrection story. It is not my lucky day that I got out of it. I do think it's interesting the way that you're saying to look at it, and I would love to do a little bit more of the tracing on this. This is something that is high. This is a new paper for anybody who hasn't seen it. We just put it out a month ago. So this is high on my list also to sort of think about how we can look at the reference points of exactly how much they lost, or maybe, if they're bringing more money in, because I can see that they're bringing more money into their wallet. What are they doing with the new money that they've decided to add and stuff like that?
So in some sense, you very early on, I remember when you started your motivation, you basically described that people who were dinged by the Great Recession basically was a generation that chose not to invest in the stock market. And in many ways here, it's almost the opposite behavior, right? So these are people that have been dinged and then they go, well, now I really have to. Is that about right? Is that what
So
we
this
see?
is, I mean, I think this is where it's really interesting, and I really do love the it's Marina's paper, Marina with Shimon, I think Shimon's on it, that the when they because they had eToro accounts which is sort of just like our Robinhood. I don't know, I don't have any Toro account, but you can see crypto trades right next to your equity trades, and they're all in like one thing. And they show that the people who trade in crypto who also traded equity clearly use different strategies in the two asset classes, that it's a bifurcated strategy. And so in that sense, it doesn't as much surprise me here, but this is where I'd love to see the new money they're putting into the wallet. Are they putting the new money then into more risky stuff, or exactly how are they engaging in this? The momentum results actually give me solace though, because what they find at least is the main strategy followed by crypto traders is momentum, and we do not see it as being a high momentum trade, which would be a little bit more, I don't have attention, I just got totally crushed because I didn't get my stuff out fast enough. So now I'm going to just trade whatever's hot. I don't think we're seeing that. I do think of it as more consistent with, and I think Alex Lamas has really nice work on this of, look, I lost this. And I think what would show us this is exactly how much they lost at insolvency relative to their whole portfolio. If you could see that it's scaled with the amount that they lost relative, that would be a really cool finding. I don't know, haven't tested it yet. Sorry.
Good luck finding it.
Okay. So then next thing, we decide to extend it to the cultural heterogeneity. These are a little trickier, right? Because in some sense it's a triple diff, but because I have Terra Luna controls, it's like a quadruple diff. And so I had to spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to do it. Hopefully my screen comes back. And so what we really want to look at here is the one that's capturing the broader beta 4, right? This is the culture specific response, and if it's different, and then beta 5 is saying, oh, is there a broader just response to the Celsius collapse in general? Okay. And so what you're going to see here is that indeed we do seem to see, again, differences, but now it's really driven by the people at the tails, right? So if I look at the lowest quartile and the highest quartile, that's where you see them being distinctively different, whereas in the middle, they're similar. Same thing here and here with power distance, and this is individualism for transactions. And this is the part where, to me, it was really like, wait, so you're in the lowest quartile of individualism, you're going to send more transactions. You're in the highest quartile of individualism. Now all of a sudden, you're not doing transactions. I thought you were the type of person that like traded early. This is still a part that I'm a little bit, in some ways maybe perplexed by. Although again, though, when you look at the break it down in low versus high risk, it's a similar pattern. And so what I think of this as sort of what I saw before is that, they're likely adding these high individual users who trade less are likely adding to low risk tokens consisting with like their idea of acting independently. They're not doing what their peers are doing. All of a sudden, peers are gambling for resurrection. You're like, I think you're crazy. Let me go do my own thing and put it in stable coins and ride out this storm. Which is, again, the same idea of being, which is very different than trust. So it'll be very interesting when I do get these trust results that I want to look at how they play out, because that's why individualism to me takes such a striking tone here, whereas deference to authority, which is very much, again, though, like, are you doing what the group's doing or not? And you end up doing what the group's doing, right? Everybody's gambling for resurrection. You're more likely to gamble for resurrection too. Okay. And I wanted to bring this up. It was a great suggestion somebody had, and so I wanted to show that we're working on it. So I think it's sort of cool, right? This is when it froze, and you can see these are all the attempts at user withdrawals, the number of transactions prior to the collapse. Here's the collapse. And then what happened here? What is this? What is this data that we have? So, and why did it even spike here? They were paying their interest rates at a weekly basis. And remember, we told you that there was other accounts, right? There was the custody account that you could withdraw from, but there was also earn accounts. And so we see people who are trying to transfer from their earn to their custody and trying to do different things, but they're like not going through in the transactions. And it's much smaller, right? This is like very negligible, but it is still there. And so we decided to look at it. We roughly get, in this period, I think it was like 300 transactions. We get many more, like 7,000 people in this pre-period, but this is just like really close to it. And again, you can set it up as a fuzzy RDD where, what you're doing in your running variable, I'm just looking at your relative to the cutoff. And I'm saying, when did you try to do a transaction relative to the cutoff? And then did you succeed in getting stuff out? And when I'm doing this, mind you, and so what we tend to think of for RDD is, right, they're very internally valid, which means, but they probably don't generalize because it's a very close place. But one thing that's nice is that here, even here, I can see them going towards higher risk, which is very consistent, again, with this gambling for resurrection. So this is a new part that is, I think, pretty cool. And then let's think about other robustness we're looking at. We're looking at large depositors, right? So I said we cut off 1,000 or 10,000. It's consistent results, both on the culture stuff and on the traditional signals stuff. It's actually even stronger on the traditional signals stuff, which isn't surprising since they're the people who engage in that. Terra Luna, we've done it different ways. I've tried a lot of different ways, and I think it's pretty robust to different versions you can do. Alternative culture measures. So this is uncertainty avoidance was one of the other ones we pulled because people had told me that maybe uncertainty avoidance would be similar to the theory. I also put here, I plan to explore gender. I've had people bring up Terry O'Dean's The Boys Will Be Boys paper, and then trust using the World Values Survey. That is on my list to do. And then I think other limitations, right? There's algorithms. Algorithms can be wrong. LLMs hallucinate. There's wallet level analysis. It's a subsample, right? They're not the full depositor base. And then, theoretically, this could be a different group, especially than TradFi. And so in my conclusion, I really want to spend this moment just thinking about the way I think about it, which is identity is this double-edged sword in bank runs. So you have a constituted depositor identity can create opposing forces. So in normal times, it can lower acquisition costs, right? You talk to your friends through this social network, through this like trust, you get more people in. There's faster information diffusion and it enables stability. But then you have this concentrated identity. And we have seen this. Charlie Calamares, other people have really nice work on it, looking at immigrant banks. But even in 2008 in New York City, there was a run on a bank that was just because it was concentrated in a very small geographic region. Or you could say the same thing about SVB, right? It was a set of VC bankers who all had the same professional identity, who all did sort of the same thing in terms of their beliefs. And then they had to synchronize in their revision. And when you synchronize in your revision, it coordinates activity and it amplifies run dynamics. And I think this is an underappreciated channel, and I think it's one that is worth thinking about from a policy perspective, right? What could you do? Well, what would have helped here? In a policy perspective, that's really when you want to enhance the credibility signal, right? If they would have had more credible information, it could have mitigated this amplification channel. And so I think of that as what can you put out there in crypto? And I really, accounting, finance, whoever, electrical engineering, I would love to see more thoughts about really what an optimal disclosure statement would look like for this. And I know, people are like, oh, we're going to go to these third parties to risk management, and Gauntlet can do it, or whoever can do it. That's one person. I don't like putting trust in a centralized person. I would rather that we have a system that we can look at it more broadly. And I think part of that is getting to a cohesive set of metrics. And so I think of that as sort of something that should be high on a list. And so thinking potentially about identity concentration as a risk factor. In conclusion, we're using the Celsius collapse as sort of a quasi-experiment. Pre-collapse, we find monitoring and exposure matter. We find users respond to all the traditional stuff, news, token, insider activity, insider trades. But culture also shapes behavior. Post-collapse, we find the stranded wallets really cut basic transfers and they reallocate away from their safe assets towards high-risk tokens. That's consistent with gambling for resurrection. But we again see that this cultural heterogeneity persists. And so I think our takeaways are that monitoring is necessary but not sufficient. Cultural norms can amplify or dampen responses, adding this dual-edged sword. And so we may need to treat depositor identity as a risk factor or treat it in a way that we can put information out there to mitigate some of the flows that would happen. And I don't think this is going to be, I'm certain this is not the last collapse in the crypto space, and so, or the last crisis. And it'll be really important to make sure as we move forward, the trust is baked into the system as well. Thank you.
Well, as they say, every crisis is different.
It is different. Thank you. Good job.
Well, thank you so much, Jillian. This was excellent. I mean, I think you're raising actually quite a lot of big questions after, all right? So if you go with the cultural part, and I'm going to bring back Canada, right? When you have a budget and you have to say for whom is this actually a good thing? Now, I don't want to endorse any of what they've said, but I think there's an interesting thought there, which is like there is a particular clientele that is interested in this particular thing, and maybe you should think about this. If this is your clientele, that you actually have to act in a manner which is consistent with mitigating harm to them, right? In a way, right? Not, I mean, this is a very big topic, and I don't think we're gonna get there, generally speaking, from a policy perspective, because that's kind of not how the law works, right? But I think that's really, you made some interesting points, are really interesting questions of, what is it actually that you need as disclosure for which kind of group, who needs to know what, right? So that's it sounds like there's no one size fits all. Is that probably fair to say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all about embedding regulation or using the technology to your advantage to recognize that it's not one size fits all. I think that is a great takeaway.
Now, I want to be mindful of time because we are actually at time. And if there are any more questions, people should put them, I think, in the Q&A, but I don't see anything there at this point. And Andre, I hope we answered your questions. Now, again, Jill, thank you so much for coming and for presenting this paper. For the wonderful presentation. I thought I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did too. And so be mindful of mind. I think this is the end of our webinar, and I hope to see you all next time. I'm not sure when we have the next webinar, but if you don't know, we will announcing it on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and it is also on our website, ciberforum.org. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and see you next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye.